Before we get started, do you have any questions for me?
I'm just really excited to be here, Suma. I'm just so grateful that we've connected and that we share the same interests and passions. So I would like to ask you how you came to this. It's extraordinary that a young, beautiful engineer would be so interested in the problems of duality and non-duality. How did that happen?
You're very kind, Sally, and it's very generous of you to first ask me question. I think the best teachers are also great listeners, so you are obviously already exemplifying that. I just followed my inner voice. Like I was always deeply curious about these topics, and I have, like you, I have a lot of passion for these subjects. I can spend endless hours researching these topics. Like there's something about it, like the more I research them, like you can kind of like go in this artistic zone where you're just lost, and it's very joyful. I can't explain that feeling. It's as an artist, I'm sure you can relate to that.
Yeah, I would say that that is the experiential altered states. And we can talk about that because they're real and they're very important. They're guides.
I'm very curious about your background because you obviously have a very strong academic background. I saw last night when I was reading your bio, you have a very impressive record of like from the education perspective. So for someone like you to, because education surely requires a lot of left brain thinking. So I'm curious, for someone like you, how did you get into the creative world, which tends to be more abstract?
Yeah, so, we could, first of all, I should say to any listeners, I come from a multidisciplinary background, as you say. So I'll be using language from all those disciplines, some of which is metaphorical, some of which is scientific. And that is because my own brain is very balanced. It's left and right brain. So I look at maps from my left brain and I look at metaphors from my right brain, and I'm no longer distinguishing that one is closer to the truth than the other. So I dive between language from my passion for Hindu philosophy, because that's very metaphorical, but is a deep truth, to science, which is research-based, and you only have credibility if there's data. Totally comfortable in that. I have a PhD. I had to learn how to do that. It wasn't easy for me because I am a creative. I'm a right brain person. So I've had to balance my own brain in order to articulate what I knew to be true in my body. So you don't get any credibility for sharing that unless you can be left-brained and teach it. So that was part of my journey, is I knew these truths from experience and study with my Hindu neighbors and my artist friends. But if you can't translate that into left-brained, logical, rational language, you don't have credibility. So my journey was to integrate my own brain through various practices, which we can talk about. And weirdly, that then turned out to be the thing that I needed to understand most, which is the deepest integration that is possible for a human. It's at the brain level, but we'll talk about the various levels of integration that I've come to see as a unity. And it started off with understanding Hindu thinking, and Taoist thinking, which is 3,000-year-old wisdom, that really got it, that the body is operating in duality, that it's a binary process and needs integration. And then I looked at the science of that and Ian McGilchrist, and I looked at all sorts of things, including gender politics, and I put all that together as a meta map for something that I call integral Taoism. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, I would definitely love to delve more into that. beginning with your own experience, like how, was there an experience that kind of like motivated you to research this topic? Like how did you begin your own journey?
Yeah, so, you know, genetically, there's an inheritance from my lineage that my parents were quite creative. My dad was an architect, my mum a classical trained dancer at a high level. They loved literature, they loved music, they loved art. So I grew up in a family that was pro human creativity. It wasn't a scary thing, it was just part of life. So that's what I was immersed in. So as a young kid, I started drawing. My dad taught me how to draw, my mom taught me how to dance. And I started experiencing altered states as a kid. I would color and I would go into an altered state. And only in adulthood do I realize that's what it was, that the rhythmic use of the body starts integrating the brain and you can go into a higher state. I didn't understand any of that. Later, as a student of theater, for example, I had a mystical experience while I was on the stage, and I'll describe that. It looked in my mind as the Tao, the black and white. So I was standing in the light on the stage, performing, because I was a theater student. And I was looking into the darkness where I couldn't see anybody, but I knew they were all there. It was a rich field of potential in the darkness that I was connecting to and communicating with on the stage, but I couldn't see the individual faces. It was a field. And I experienced this massive explosion of ecstasy, understanding the unity of what I was doing. I was using my voice and I was connecting with the field. And there was no fear. I went into an egoless state. It was timeless. And I realized that I had entered a higher state, and I could start doing that every night of the 8 nights of performance. So I started cultivating that awareness. So that was random, spontaneous. But then I became very interested in studying what was going on. I connected with my Hindu neighbors in South Africa and started studying yoga very deeply from a very young age, authentic yoga. I later connected with some profound tantric teachers, classical tantra. So I was understanding how the body itself is an instrument. It's a binary instrument. Even the nostrils can take you into different states. They understood metaphorically about Ida and Pingala, the masculine and the feminine within the body, which actually we understand now as the brain hemispheres. But they intuitively knew that thousands of years ago. So the word yoga itself is about integration. So I was learning classical integration methods. And then later over my life, I came across academic stuff that understood that in a different way. So integral theory, left brain, right brain, neurology, working with parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Then I became interested in gender politics and see how that shows up through hormones, the differences. Slowly, I started putting this map together of and understanding even the physics of it, you know, the dipolar nature of the universe with negative and positive charges and North and South Pole and day and night, winter, summer. And so this has been slowly revealed to me through my life experience that there's an underlying duality, and we can eventually come to see the non-duality of the whole picture. So there's a movement from binaries to polarities, to complementarities, to unity. That's the mechanism that you begin to see life is a binary. It's beautiful. It's a dance. It's duality, manifestation. But within that, there's the overlying non-duality, and we can tap into that with altered states. We can actually experience it and then begin to believe in it and see it.
Since you have studied Hindu philosophy, there are obviously so many different ways of describing non-duality. So what has been your observation? Like, what are your thoughts on all these different thought schools and different ways of talking about non-duality?
Yeah, it's a subject that can be interpreted from our different stages of development. So we'll need to look at spiral dynamics, because until we understand that we can see reality, but it's through a filter always. And the filter is determined by our stage of development. We can't see that there's a dance between our own body instrument and what's really out there. So non-duality is experienced from different stages as you yourself develop. So, you know, there's the pre-personal experience of it as a little baby, when you're in your mum's arms and there's no separation between you and mum, you're one. And then you begin to cry as you're separated, and left in a room begins to terrify you until you realize you're a separate being. So then you don't understand formally yet what non-duality is, but you feel it in your body, and it's terrifying as a little kid until you trust that. And then we go through the stages of development, which you and I can talk about. And then as we mature into turquoise and beyond, we begin to understand that non-duality can really be experienced as a structure, not just a random state that kind of bursts through at various stages. It's a structure in which you can live transpersonal as opposed to pre-personal. And so you come back to that state as a mature adult, but having gone through a separation process and a rational process and a journey. It's a hero's journey of separation from the mother or the void, understanding duality as a play of binaries which can produce conflict. And we need to learn how to deal with that, and the boundaries and the openness, the two ways of being and doing, how to play with the polarities. And then we come later at the later stages to understand the non-duality and live in both at the same time. That's the difference. A baby's not aware of the split, the object-subject split. We have to go through that journey as we mature, and then we understand there is no split at a different level.
I love that metaphor of a mother and a baby compared, like, with how it feels like when you separate yourself from the void. I think a lot of us, especially those who are in this, who do self-inquiry, can relate to that separation. How would you explain, like for someone who is new, like how would you explain, although this is a simple realization, why is it so profound? Like how can it deeply transform you?
Yeah, Suma, this is critical. And I'm in a long lineage of people who speak about it, going right back to the Buddha, who spoke about suffering, and right back to Jesus, who spoke about love as healing suffering. And so at the core of our nervous system, there is a binary, that parasympathetic, sympathetic, and we need both. So we need to learn how to navigate that. And that is a response to our context. So we'll either flip into fight and flight or into rest and digest, depending on our context. So suffering and trauma really gets us stuck in fight and flight. And that's not an optimal way of being. It's very corrosive, not only for our body with the chemicals that are released, but with our culture, because we're then in conflict with everything. We're coming from fear. So understanding the body as the place where fear or love is generated is how we work with our suffering. And the yogis knew that from the beginning. They didn't have the science behind it, and we do now. So trauma, which is a brand new field and is so necessary for understanding suffering, is when we get stuck in fight and flight and we begin to isolate and disconnect as a way to stay safe. It's like a frozen, the yogis would understand that as a frozen energy in our body flow. So if something terrible happened to us as a kid, we now have words for that. It's called the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, an early developmental trauma. Parts of us will get stuck at that age and they're frozen, they're terrified, they were overwhelmed. So they prevent us from being present. So the part of healing, and specifically through yoga, is to release those blockages that are held in the body. That trauma is literally held in the body. And we release it through various methods. I've been in rooms where people have been crying, releasing decades of karmic load. And, you know, there's somatic body practices and a lot of other profound ways. There's tracking with eyes of trying to come into the present moment again. That's the healing. So we can't really be present with reality or others if we're carrying a trauma load. Yeah, there's parts of us that need to be developed and brought forward so that we're acting as a unity with our context.
And how would you point to, I guess, non-duality, because that's like one of the first steps to ease out this trauma and suffering?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question, Suma, because if you can't enter one of these altered, we call them altered, but they're not altered, they're real states, you can't get any relief from the cortisol and adrenaline and the anxiety and fear. So it's literally at our core, the nervous system needs management to begin to feel that relief in what we call non-duality. It's a state. So, and also other people call it the true self, as opposed to the separate self. So it's an identity as well. So the more you can access that state, which is very real, and we would probably characterize that as the dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin release from the pituitary gland as well, that the yogis call the third eye. The more we can enter that state and raise the bliss level of our body as opposed to the fear, cortisol, adrenaline axis, the more we can start to trust the universe, the more full we feel instead of empty. That's very important. So the more we can give to others. Because if we're running on empty, we've got nothing to give. We're just in preservation. So entering the states often enough, because our brain is plastic, that's the beauty we've discovered with neuroscience. Our brain can literally be rewired through practices. We do that enough, that becomes a permanent structure, a stage, not just a state that comes and goes randomly and is beyond our control. We can actually learn to control the state, induce it, and make it permanent. That is the miracle of yoga. And that's why I keep going back to that ancient practice, despite being a thoroughly research-based academic. There's no alternative for that in academia.
I'm seeing this more and more, Sally. I don't know if you noticed that too. Like I'm, especially through some of these non-duality conversation, it seems more apparent that until that separation drops off, it's like all these other ways of healing, they are kind of like band-aid fix until you see through this non-dual state.
Yeah, totally, Suma. So as you say, the other techniques are necessary, but they're not as deep. When we start working with our nervous system at that depth, and our left and right brain, which is the integral Taoism part of that I teach, we don't have mastery over this vehicle. It's an instrument. And if we're relying still on external things to get us into a higher state, we will always be on the back foot. So if we're relying on our relationships to provide us with peace, if we're relying on a peaceful situation in our country, if we're relying on psychedelics, which is the new fad, these things are all really supportive of experiencing peace and a state of mind that we all crave. But then we become addicted because we can't do it on our own. And so we're relying on external structures. Yoga teaches us to do that internally on our own and how to live there. I don't think there's a more liberating practice on the planet than mastery of the self and the nervous system. It's real. States are real and can be entered with mastery in a second. You can just go there. So the more you fill your own tank, the more you can give to others. So it doesn't end with you, and it's not, I'll just use the word masturbatory. It's not about me sitting here trying to feel good. It's about me filling my tank so that I can keep giving to others.
I would love to know your insights on different stages that you have observed in this journey, as well as also how you mentioned about integral dualism, like what role does that play in this different stages of development?
Yeah. So what I'd started noticing, because I was dipping into a variety of disciplines, and I didn't know why really, until much later I started noticing there's a core tenet here that I'm noticing about transformation. So I was doing a lot of art, I was studying psychology, I was looking at all the new philosophies, the integral philosophy, spiral dynamics. I was looking at trauma. I was deeply into classical tantric yoga. And then I started notice, and feminism and education. And they were all talking about transformation, but from their own lens. So they were only getting a part of it. And so what my life journey has shown me, without knowing until recently, that I was tracking the core pattern within each of the disciplines and their central mechanisms for transformation that they were all looking at from different lenses. And so that's what I'm writing about. Most of that is about the object-subject split. I'm using language now that might confuse people, but Wilber came up with what he calls, Ken Wilber, the 4 quadrants, which is a wonderful frame. And what I noticed was that different disciplines fall in different parts of the frame, and they were looking at the object-subject split from their own little lens. That would show up as a gender binary, that would show up as left-right brain binary, that would show up in quantum physics as charges and different dipolar energies and poles. And and also this tracks through history. So I went back to the great tantric texts and the Taoist texts that had intuited that what we're doing at our core is integrating this binary. And I had this wonderful experience. I went to China to visit my sister, and I was sitting in a park And I was watching all these meditative practices in the green space between these high density apartment buildings. And everybody would come out down to the park to practice their meditation. And there were hundreds of forms of it. There was dancing meditation, there was Tai Chi, there was Qigong, there was painting with water on the sidewalk and watching it disappear as it evaporated. And I was watching a fellow who was standing on 2 bricks, and there were 2 bricks in front of him. And he would invite somebody to step up onto the bricks, and he would start this martial art. And he would explain in Mandarin. I had no Mandarin, but I could see what he was doing. The only contact was between the wrist and the elbow, and you would touch each other there. And the only other rule was that you would look each other in the eye. And then you would start to move and try to push your opponent off their brick. And he was doing that, I could see, in this profound balancing of being grounded, being sunk into his solar plexus, and moving with flexibility and rhythm, and feeling and listening to his partner until he could make them lose their balance. He called me over, like weird. I was like the only blonde person in the park, and he singled me out. I was far away, and he said, "You come here." And I'm an introvert. I said, "No, I'm not coming in." He called me a couple of times, so I went over, and he invited me onto the bricks, and we did this dance. And Suma, my sister captured it on film. I had the most deepest breakthrough of my life, and he taught me what this integration feels like in your body as an enactment, an engagement with the other. There were no words. I have no Mandarin, but he showed me within 20 minutes what this deepest teaching is about. It's Taoism. It shows up in Tantra, classical Tantra, about being both strong and soft, about being grounded as well as heart-centered, how to bring these qualities of yin and yang together into the present moment with hyper focus as well as general focus. When you're in that state, you can't be knocked off your bricks. And so we went on and on and on for about a half hour until he stepped back off his bricks and bowed, because he realized he'd given me that lesson in that moment. And I was in that zone. Neither of us would win or lose. We were balanced. So from that moment, I realized this is not just about hemispheric integration. It's not just about Ida Pingala. It's not about right, left, brain, nostril. It's about a way of being. And the Bhagavad Gita teaches that all doing needs to come from being. And the Taoists teach that all of our natures are yin, and that yang emerges from that only when needed as the gentle pressure of opposition. So over years of having this shown to me, this is what I'm starting to write about now. And it totally takes polarity teaching, which is out there all the time with male, female, gender dynamics, to a much higher level. This is high level meta polarity work that I teach, because it's in all 4 quadrants. It's not just about men and women. It's about seeing over the life pattern how men and women have to separate in order to procreate, and how as they get older, they come back into that unity as their hormones drop off and revert to this yin state. The testosterone drops away and we become more balanced again. So this is so interesting that our life journey, we start out as a unity at puberty. We separate in order to procreate, and then we come back together as a unity until we go back to the void. Integral stages reflect that in some way. So does modernity. and as we come into meta-modernity. So it's happening at every level, existentially as well as in our bodies.
And from what I've looked at your work, it seems like this yin and yang exist. It's not only gender-based, but it also exists in each person. Like we all have this yin and yang within ourselves. How do we go about integrating those? Even before, how do we go about integrating those two polarities? Why is it important to integrate those two polarities within us?
Yeah, so maybe we should bring this to look at the stages of development, which spiral dynamics, we call it, and that's Cowan and Beck and Graves's work that integral theory has adopted. It even shows up there, even though they haven't noticed it so much and it's never been remarked upon. This oscillation between the stages goes from a yin stage to a yang stage to a yin stage to a yang stage. Beck and Cowan and Graves, they called it warm and cool stages. They didn't call it yin and yang, but that's what it is. There's a stage of emerging and then a stage of emerging and emerging dynamic. Because we start off very much in a binary of male and female so that we can co-create, so we can reproduce. There's a charge between the masculine and the feminine when it's separated. But as we mature, that dance becomes more and more internal until our left and right brains are actually working as a unity. And that charge becomes more about co-creating rather than procreating as we mature and get older. So it's very necessary to start off as a charged binary, and that's where the gender wars are. But they're not taking that further because they're still stuck in the dating system. But when you're beyond the dating system, you begin to see the underlying pattern, that's necessary but temporary. And then that dynamic continues within your body, but at a much more internal level, so that the dance is internal. And that's where we begin to be our most creative, is when we're integrating both the yin and the yang within us. So we can invite the imaginal yin, the intuitive, back in, and then we can also manifest and reach audiences through the yang, the execution. So I've noticed people who have all the imagination in the world but can't execute. They don't reach an audience. Or these beautiful engineering brains that have all the problem-solving execution, but they're iterating the known all the time. They're not going into the imaginal and pushing culture forward, but they're beautifully solving all our problems. So we need both. But when the left and the right brain integrate, we become our most creative, not procreative.
And do you think some of these, and you know a lot, way better about gender issues than I do you think some of these gender issues that are popping up, they could be outward manifestation of not having that inner yin and yang integrated within ourselves?
Yeah, so if we look at the stages, and I'm not sure if your audience is familiar with this, but the blue or amber stage of our development relies heavily on gender binary, which is sanctioned by the religion. Women need to have their place and men have their place, and they do different jobs. The masculine protects and provides, and the feminine nurtures and educates in the home and creates a home. And so if we're at that blue stage, that is perfect. That's how we create a family. So I'm not denigrating it. It's necessary in our development, but we needn't get stuck there. So as women move into orange, they become more masculine. they start to have their own income, they become liberated. It's the beginnings of understanding the power dynamics that keep them in the blue stage of being feminine. And then men at that level start saying, oh, you're too masculine, I'm not sexually attracted to you. And men, as they enter green, become more feminine because they become aware of the power dynamics, they get more in touch with their emotions, they maybe go to therapy and understand that they can have a whole body and feel it all, they can cry, they can be gentle. And women at orange will say, oh, you're too feminine for me. So there's a slight blockage there, that the gender wars are still there. But once you go beyond that, you realize that you're fluid. You can become masculine or feminine as needed. You can hold down a really good job, become economically independent, and when you're at home, you can play sexually with that dynamic. You're not stuck in a binary at all. You become more complex. And then as you progress through the stages, that binary you notice is internal. So the masculine and feminine really starts to get ecstatic, orgasmic within the self. It doesn't rely on another body to take you to orgasm. It doesn't even rely on a tool or your hand. It's immediate because it's actually internally generated orgasm. So that's from my tantric language. In neurology, that might be called explosions of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin that you can generate by sitting on a cushion and just going there. So the external orgasm that you relied on a partner with now is literally internal once you've reached that level of unity.
Even from, by the way, you beautifully described how this fits in well with, from both like spiral dynamics perspective, as well as the outward manifestation we see in the world. But I wanted to also get your input on from an esoteric perspective, because you have spoken a bit about Kundalini, and some of these old thought schools, they also point about how that union between divine feminine and masculine is kind of key to be able to have that final wake up, like not just realization of non-duality, but to really fully tap into your potential. So I would love to get your thoughts on how does this, if you could explain, like, how does this look like from a Kundalini awakening perspective?
So others have spoken about how the East tends to be more right-brained, which prefers understanding truth through metaphor. And the West is left-brained, more dominant, and prefers understanding reality through maps. So we've got maps that I love from the West, but the metaphors of India that originated thousands of years ago say it all. You know, the beautiful partnerships between Shiva and Parvati, or Ram and Sita, or, you know, this love relationship between equal partners was a beautiful archetype that was intuitively understood very early in the Hindu culture. And various branches of that take that archetype, which is a cosmic archetype, and of how love is sustained. And they try to bring it into technologies in the body. So there are hundreds of different forms of yogic practice. So yoga is a branch of Hinduism, which takes it into the body or the philosophy of the mind. And within those, there are various practices. So tantric yoga started playing with duality and non-duality as feminine and masculine. So the Shiva Shakti, consciousness and energy, how they work together within the body. And then there were branches of that in South India that took that into the sexual, understanding the orgasm at the body level, as well as the cosmic level. So that is the beauty of the Hindu multitude of practices. At the core of this is the understanding that the masculine and feminine play together all the time. Ida and Pingala, the warm and cool parts of the body and the brain, and within the masculine and feminine sexual, within the archetypes of the gods and goddesses. They didn't have the science, the neuroscience that we have now from the West that understands that more as not only hormonal, but hemispherical. They didn't have the understanding of the stages, although they had their own stages. Beautiful developmental maps came out of India. But the one we use in the West for integral psychology also shows that, although they've never, ever owned that. I can see it because I come from an Eastern perspective. It's right there. Why can't anybody see it? So Kundalini, let's speak into Kundalini. They understood that if we play with the warm and cool currents in the body, something ignites. That brings us into an intensity and an aliveness and our full potential over time. They called that Kundalini. That itself is a metaphor. You can't see Kundalini. It's not a real channel in the body, although many would say the nadis are real. There's a definite body-based structure to this. That is real. But even if it's just a metaphor, we understand that bringing these currents together creates the potential. And that's understood in Taoism, that's understood in the Bhagavad Gita, it's understood with the love partners in Hindu mythology. In the West, we call that now Eros. So Eros is this ignited aliveness, this passion to become as full as we can in our potential. And it is an erotic engagement with evolution. So it can't be done in isolation. We know that, like, these things happen through an erotic union between self and other, self and landscape, self and the divine, the internal selves. And it's like in Hindu mythology, it's referred to as a snake, the Kundalini that comes up the spine, opens the chakras, which are the stages that Maslow referred to. It's exactly the same, state the needs, from the physical to the sexual, to the power, to the heart, to the throat, to the mind. That's the self-actualization that Maslow referred to. It's the same as the chakras. Jung referred to it as the subconscious coming up into consciousness. That's Kundalini. He was a yogi. He never told that to his Western friends, but he was a committed yogi. Someone like Wilhelm Reich talks about the body and the somatics of releasing the blockages. That's chakra work. So we owe everything to Indian understandings that were intuitive. And what we've done is bring scientific understanding to what has always been true.
And do you agree, Sally, when some gurus, when they talk about how until in the early stages, it is like it's okay to not have that balance. It's okay to not have that integration. One may still be able to get to the point of non-dual realization, but beyond that, that integration of subconscious and conscious mind, as well as integration of thinking mind, feeling, all these different types of fragmented pieces, it becomes difficult to move beyond without integrating them.
Yeah, so the journey to integration eludes many folks, and so it's one of the greatest privileges on the planet to even have the time to explore this beyond just trying to feed yourself and your family. So I understand that this can sound like the ultimate privilege to have the resources, whether that's time, finances, educational opportunity, coming across the right teacher. These are all privileges. I get that. And in Hindu philosophy, that would be a karmic thing because you've had multiple lives. So in the West, if we don't open to that, you come into a human body, which would be considered the ultimate privilege by some, because now you have the opportunity to become more conscious. So it feels like a crapshoot for many people because they're just so busy trying to get enough finances to feed themselves and their family. And to me, that's one of the greatest sufferings on the planet is that everybody wants to awaken. That's the urge, that's the internal drive for all of us. And that's mapped in Maslow, it's mapped all over the place. The actualization drive is real. And there's suffering when we don't have the context to allow that. It's really hard. So we get trapped in suffering. We don't know how to access the technologies for dealing with that. And there's real technologies out there because we're just too busy. I can't explain that. I'm not God. I don't know how some little white girl from Africa got to meet some of the greatest teachers on the planet and study with them. I can't explain that privilege. But I do realize it's now my responsibility to share that in understandable language that is informed with science, that is informed with the great metaphors from the East, that is informed through the 4 quadrants, which include feminism and object-subject split, and all the ways that I know it's talking about the same thing. And that's my job, is to interpret that for folks.
Yeah, it is a privilege. And I think internet has kind of increased that privilege even for an ordinary person, because now instead of having to travel and meet someone, we can at least like have an opportunity to listen to some of these teachers online.
And so, these great teachers are sometimes stuck in a pre-modern era of hierarchy. And so I can move that forward. I understand the gender binary that's the pre-modern just keeps replicating. Some of those traditions taught that the best karma was to be in a male body, and you hadn't made it if you were in a female body. You'd have to come back. I mean, there's belief systems within those great structures that are just outdated. So my job is to deconstruct what's not relevant anymore and to reconstruct in a meta way what I understand to be integral Taoism. I don't call it Tantra, although it is, because Neo-Tantra keeps it trapped in gender binary of dating and how to attract a mate. So there's so much, it's a very low level part of the polarity teaching. So I wanted to give it a name that's about the actual dynamics of emergence, which Taoism kind of encapsulates.
Can you comment a bit more on that? I would love to understand more, like how the differences between integral Taoism and Neo-Tantra. Yeah.
So there are lots of polarity teachers out there, and they're necessary because it's a beginner stage of understanding the gender binary. So I won't name names, but there are lovely teachers out there who teach about the Yin Yang dance between male and female. But that's where it stays. They don't understand that as a internal principle, which yoga teaches about and Taoism teaches about. They don't understand that as a principle of the cosmic emergence itself, with that polarity binary in positive, negative charge, in north-south magnet polarity, the dipolar nature of quantum physics itself. So their little part of the polarity teachings is partial. It's true, but partial. And Ken Wilber would say it's just in the one quadrant. But if you look at a polarity teaching in all four quadrants, which is my integral Taoism, it looks at the brain, it looks at the nervous system, it looks at the interiors of the object-subject split. It looks at the cultural, institutional conflict where women are still devalued, or the feminine or the yin. That has to go in order for us to get to this integral level. Women's bodies and reproduction and dating are a tiny part of this. Feminism highlighted the politics of this. So it's also a tiny part of it, how the yin is devalued. And on the interior, the left and the right brain, in the other quadrant, how left brain chauvinism, we always devalue the imaginal or the creative, even within ourselves. So this split shows up at every level of existence. So that's my contribution, is noticing how it's partial in so many disciplines, this understanding, and I'm bringing it together into a kind of a map, that it exists in every discipline.
Is that the map, the 4-quadrant one, or is...
That's a lens. So I just use that lens because nobody else has applied the lens to Taoism and noticed that it includes gender work. It includes parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic. It includes left and right brain. It includes subconscious and conscious. It includes the cultural work of creativity. So Wilber just invented a frame. I'm applying his frame to my work, which is the Yin Yang unity, which hasn't been done before. So I'm drawing on pre-modern teachings. I'm drawing on modern science. I'm drawing on postmodern feminism that deconstructs power hierarchies. And now I'm bringing that together in a meta map, how the ancients knew the stuff thousands of years ago, but they just didn't have the science yet. So that's what I'm doing.
That's a beautiful insight, Sally. I do notice that because there are so many different ways to talk about this, when someone is a beginner, it can be quite overwhelming. And
that's why I'm writing a book. I'm doing it as simply as I can, because I should explain, I am not bringing any dogma into the world. All I'm doing is showing that this is generated internally, that it's emergent. There are no answers, but it's a practice. So I would just call it very sophisticated polarity work. It's polarity work at the highest level, as opposed to neo-tantra, which is just sexual attraction, which is included but transcended in my model. That's the beginning. That polarity is the beginning, but there's so many stages to bring that polarity until we're completely integrated and optimally creative.
Yeah, I remember when I was new, like sometimes it used to be confusing because some teachers can present a fragmented teaching in a way that sounds as though like that is it, like that's the way things are, that's the whole picture. And when you're new, like you may challenge your own intuition that this person seems to be a lot more experienced than me. So, but it's a way to learn. Like eventually you start trusting your own instinct and get over that hump.
You absolutely on the nail there, that your heart guides you. You know intuitively where the next teacher is, right? And then you're ready for that, and then you outgrow them. And that's the beauty of teacher-student relationships is they've seen a perspective, you're attracted to that, you gain that perspective, and then you move on. Yeah. That's why I don't believe in single gurus anymore, because they each have a part of the puzzle, and it's up to you to integrate the parts. Yeah, and I should just say also, you know, that when you do get to see a bigger picture, Suma, it doesn't mean that pain goes away. Suffering goes away. So there's a difference. You know, there'll always be pain, pleasure guiding us. That's beautifully innate in our body. So the pleasure attracts us to things like even teachers, and the pain makes us move away from things. So there's aversion and attraction built into our nervous system, and that's our guide. It's beautiful. That doesn't mean pain goes away. It's the other half of the binary. So we will continue to have pain, doesn't matter how enlightened we are. It's how we deal with the pain that counts. We turn it into suffering.
Yeah, we just, in my last conversation, we were talking about that the suffering may go away, but the physical body could still be in pain. Yes. But there are not suffering stories attached to it.
Yeah, so that's the part of my journey in the practical day-to-day duality, was working with large groups of people that suffer terribly. So the refugees and indigenous folks who suffered terribly from our colonization and their dehumanization by us. So suffering's kind of been my topic, and trauma is involved with that. And why I brought the creativity project to that was because it truly helps us with the suffering. And it's an emerging discipline. I'm sort of a bit of a pioneer with that. But the book I wrote, which is Art Making with Refugees and Survivors of Global Disasters, worked with people in locations around the world. This is not conceptual. This is real. People are suffering. How do we deal with that? In the last 10 years, the number of refugees has doubled from 40 million to 89 million people around the world. Suffering is not going away anytime soon. It's getting worse. Mental health issues are getting worse. So to be lost in concepts, to me, is not alleviating suffering, because people don't have really a lot of time to integrate those concepts. So I did this book with people in the field, working in refugee camps, survivors of tsunamis and earthquakes and war zones, and working in the camps to see how we could best alleviate suffering. So that book is out there if people want to learn more about practical ways to help people who are so traumatized, they've lost all their words. So they've become dislocated, dispossessed. They've been delanguaged. They have no home, no family, no language. In a camp, there's hundreds of languages. Nobody speaks your language. There's no status left. And sometimes they lose their health, and sometimes they've been sexually abused along the journey. You cannot imagine the intersection of suffering and trauma in these camps. So I wanted to work with folks working in the camps with this level of trauma, because I think we need to understand this is coming to a lot of us in the future. How do we work with collective trauma at that scale and that level of intersectional pain and loss? And there are ways. There are simple, creative, really helpful ways to help folks move through their trauma. And that's in the book. So we don't need to go into it here, but this is practical, verifiable, researched ways of helping with collective trauma.
does some of these things that we talked in our conversation today, do they get applied in at the camp, or does it end up being like a conceptual wisdom that doesn't have practical application?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm working on is the different ways, and it's modeled on the chakras, the different ways we can express our creativity. So at the base level, say Muladhara chakra, we learn how to make stuff, and we can sell it and provide for our needs. So you need to learn a few skills, you can get a craft, and you can start selling and providing for your needs. A level up from that might be at the second chakra, where we understand beauty and sexuality at a certain level of privilege. Say in Italy, they have that down to a fine art design for sexual attraction, cars, shoes, bikes, handbags. So there's beauty introduced at that second level of creativity. You know, at the third level of the will, the third chakra, we might look at how creativity gives us agency. It really empowers us to have a problem and fix it through our creative manifestation. So we become more empowered. At the heart center, we can use creativity as a therapy. It heals us. There's arts therapy. And at the fourth level, at the voice, we use creativity for activism and advocating for people who don't have a voice. The arts are used as activism. Then at the ajna, we can think of the way creativity takes us into that integrated state. It's a meditation. We go into an altered state if we're in a safe enough place, and we can practice it. And then at the seventh chakra, that becomes our identity. And I'm not going to overwhelm your listeners with that, but we understand at that level that we are a fractal of the creative universe, that evolution is working through us, and that that's who we are, is to create a better place in this world. It's creative, and that's our identity. So if you talk about the camps, we're only applying two of those: how to do craft and how to heal. So at the heart level, the others, you can't work in a camp at the other levels of creativity. So till we understand what we're doing where, and it's contextual, and you've got to be careful how you apply that, and who you're working with, always honoring the people you're working with. And they let you know at what level they want to work with that creative chakra system.
That's really difficult task to be able to combine, like how to apply these things in practical world. It's very challenging.
So can I give a brief story to make that real?
Sure.
So I worked before with Indigenous Canadians. I live in Canada, who've been deeply traumatized by colonization, and their trauma shows up in a lot of ways, some of which is fetal alcohol syndrome, addiction, incarceration. Their pain is so profound that it shows up in these various ways in their life. So I was involved in a project where a master totem pole carver was working with these young traumatized fellows, and we were carving masks and totem poles. And that is in the chapter, as a chapter in the book, so you can find out the practical ways that creativity heals at various levels, including addiction and the various traumas that have happened to folks. And we track in that chapter the dignity and the pride and the joy that returns to people as they make stuff. They become more agentic. They can see that they've got control over their world. They can manifest what's in their minds. And then they see this product that they've made, and they feel proud of themselves again. They've turned their interior world into an object that communicates with people, and they've got a voice. So it's really the voice, returning of the voice, that is the final empowerment for people through the creative act. You can do that with any person under a tree in the desert, in a concentration camp, in a refugee camp. It's restoring hope and dignity and empowerment for people who've been really disempowered through trauma. It's practical.
Usually when we talk about wisdom, Sally, it usually comes from Western world, influenced by Christianity, or it comes from some of these thought schools from India, influenced by Hinduism. What have you learned from, like, how can we bring in wisdom from like tribal wisdom into this conversation? And you have experience in integrating some of the wisdom from tribal wisdom. So I would love to bring that into this conversation also. What can we learn from that?
Yeah, Suma, it's been, I think, one of the greatest privileges of my life to work with Indigenous tribes in Africa and in Canada, who've been deeply traumatized by their histories. And they have shown me how resilient they are and how they do that. And I have the deepest respect for their survival skills and how they move into flourishing from states of great abuse. Yeah, and that's often through a couple of things, the creative structures that we spoke about. But one of the greatest resiliencies that they have is their connection to the land and to ecosystems. So if you know Maslow's pyramid of needs, he speaks about the individual working through their needs, from basic food needs to safety, to sexuality, to belonging, to actualization. So he was right, but it's very partial, because that was just the individual journey of moving from meeting your needs to enlightenment. Indigenous cultures see it the other way around. This is the great gift of Indigenous cultures, is that the community, so the primary base of our existence is the land and the water and the sunlight. Without that, you can't have a culture. So that generates humanity. Humanity generates culture, and culture generates individuals that can serve the system. So it's literally the opposite hierarchy. So it's like a star. If we look at that, it's the opposite. So their resilience comes from that. And the more we destroy that relationship for them, the more they're suffering. So, for example, in Canada now, the Canadian government's just given $800 million to Indigenous communities to become land stewards. Like, we've recognized this, that they have knowledge about ecosystems, climate change, the primary nature of Mother Earth, and how dependent we are on her, as opposed to the other way around. And so Canada's finally beginning to realize that there's knowledge that we've ignored, that's in our shadow, and that we need their leadership. And so that's what we're doing, is giving funding to protect millions of hectares of land, because without that, we will be nothing. So it's recognizing the beauty of the Indigenous wisdom and bringing that into leadership that is needed, because that's resilience. They've been here 14,000 years quite happily without us before we came and destroyed their culture. How did they do that? We need to know.
That's a super valuable insight of today's conversation. Is there anything else you would like to bring into this conversation today? I think I'm not sure if we were able to capture the different stages of development in this conversation, but if I missed anything, I would love to bring that in.
Yeah, you do have wonderful pre-existing YouTubes that explain that, Suma. So if any of your listeners are confused, and I was referring to what we call spiral dynamics, and Nish Dabashia has explained that beautifully in one of your conversations, Suma. So if the language I used was confusing, I'd refer your listeners to Nish's beautiful 4 conversations with you, because I know that I covered a lot of ground here, but it will be more slowly explained in my new book. So if this seemed overwhelming, it was a lot of information. So don't despair. I would say, sorry, Suma?
I just wanted to say you explained it so gracefully. It was easy to understand. It didn't seem like conceptual. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Sorry, go ahead.
I would suggest listeners really come to grips with spiral dynamics as a map. I would suggest that listeners don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and look at the great teachings that exist, and what they will never become irrelevant as we go into metamodernism. That is a big mistake if we think we don't need the great teachings anymore. You know, just that one core teaching that all doing should be from being. If you just remember that one thing, how do you do that? It shows up in the Bhagavad Gita, it shows up in the Tao Te Ching. Just go look at those 2 books. They capture the core tenets of non-duality. So spiral dynamics, Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, if you just do those 3 things, you've got everything you need, from the great metaphors to the great maps. And then go practice. Concepts are never enough, never enough. They're the map, not the territory. So go find a discipline that teaches you about the body and how it's an instrument to discover non-duality and bliss. It exists, it's real, and it's the only antidote to all the suffering.
One thing I wanted to ask before we wrap up, Sally, and I know this is a little bit off topic, but I had a question about you, for you, because you mentioned something about emergentism in our last conversation, and I'm new to this concept, so I know we are heading towards the end of the conversation, but if you could briefly explain that concept, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with the great pre-modern era of where the great religions started. Then we call it the modern era, where science started and rationalization. Then there's the postmodern era, which is recent, where we deconstruct all those things and we start fighting and debating, and we realize there's multiple perspectives that we need to include. It's not just our religion or our culture. There's needs to be dialogue, and we need to deconstruct. Now we're entering meta-modernism, which is where we start seeing what was best in those previous eras. What was the best about the pre-modern teachings? Can we bring those forward and leave the rest behind? What's the best of science? Science is continually disproving itself, so we need to always be up to date with the newest understandings. How do we bring those together into something that's still believable, that includes mysticism and science, that includes the binaries of maps and metaphors, that acknowledges the full embodiment of enlightenment? It's not just a concept of emptiness, it's also fullness. So metamodernism is where these new things are emerging that understand this trajectory of knowledge. So new things are showing up, and it's really exciting, and it's what we would call post-integral. So there's emergentism, There's a kind of an eco-immanence that goes back to indigenous knowledge. Emergentism is where you understand the universe is emerging from the Big Bang, and it goes through the creation of the physiosphere, to the biosphere, to what we call the noosphere, through us as humans, as we create. So there's a trajectory now that the ancient texts didn't include. They didn't know about evolution. So there's a new understanding. There's this integral Taoism. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's showing up now that is trying to tell this new story, so that we have a clearer, more inclusive picture of reality. Because we're including the pre-modern, the science, and we're deconstructing, including marginalized people, we're including bodies, we're offering the biggest frame, the biggest perspective that we can manage. And at some day, this will be outdated too. That's the nature of evolution. But we just try to keep current so that people are in despair that none of the old maps work anymore. And so we're trying to reconstruct hope and positive outlooks for folks. There's such a beauty in this. The design is unbelievable. And it doesn't ever date, but some of the principles around it date. So let's leave those behind. Let's leave the racism and the misogyny and the other things in the pre-modern teachings. Let's leave those out, but let's carry certain things forward.
And is integral emergentism, is that a small niche within emergentism? I saw some groups. I'm very new to that niche, so forgive me if I sound ignorant. Is that like a niche discipline within emergentism?
Yeah, Suma, you are not ignorant. You amaze me. You really do. Your grasp is phenomenal. Usually it takes well into old age, like me, to get a bigger picture. And anyway, so integral is a philosophy started by Ken Wilber. So, and there's lots of books out there. I would advise you to read Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, if you only read one. It's a big fat book and it will explain his philosophy. What he did was look at all the Eastern and Western ways of development and put them together in one teaching. So that's the foundation from which any new teachings emerge. So Wilber himself emerged, came up with this theory, which is profound. It's now getting a little dated. So other people are wanting to take that further into various understandings. So that's emerging. So emergentism is really just the philosophy that things keep changing and complexifying, and that we build on previous knowledge, and knowledge itself dates. So can we rely on the Bible for everything? No, we can't. But we can rely on it for some things, because it's a beautiful narrative and metaphor that arose, and some of it still applies and some doesn't. So discrimination comes into that. So all the new emergents kind of use integral as their base now. That's the foundation. But Wilber himself was partial. So there's this idea that everything, including knowledge, is holonic. In other words, it's partial, but it's true as well. So everything is true but partial. That's the nature of holon. We're all holons. We won't go into that, it's too complex, but knowledge itself is holonic, and emergentism understands that.
Thank you so much for explaining that. I'm glad I asked you this question about emergentism, because I find it valuable to encapsulate, and like it's kind of almost like a meta perspective. And some, like recently I bought books from this writer called Rudolf Steiner. He goes even deeper into like our prehistoric times, like Atlantis and Lemuria, and exploring those civilization. Sometimes we can get lost in just in our era of millennials and like just understand this, but so much has happened before that, and to have that perspective, it's very mind-blowing.
I could give you an example. So my passion, if you look at the big picture, is evolution. If you look at the little fractal of that, it's how do things emerge. If you narrow the focus, it's how do things transform. If you narrow that down, it's like how are things created through us. If you narrow that down, what is flow? And at the core of that, well-being, because if you're aligned with all of that, you're in a state of well-being. So states. So we're a fractal of evolution. The human body is a creative fractal that reflects the creative emergent nature of the universe. It actually works through us, through our bodies. So how do we use the body as an instrument for emergence, which is another fancy word for evolution through us? And that can become a spiritual practice. So that's what's happening now in the metaverse. Is some people feel this is atheist, that it's just material structures, and the rest of us feel that it's a spiritual practice. So that's kind of in metamodernism, there's a split. And so emergentism and panentheism and integral Taoism or eco-immanence feel this is a spiritual design. And then there's the Nordic atheists who feel this is kind of just materialism doing its thing, but still believe in complexification of structures. But we all feel grateful to Ken Wilber for pointing out to us certain things that he had digested. Some have rejected Ken because he's spiritual. Some of us are always grateful for Ken because he's spiritual, but didn't see some things, and now we're taking that further.
Yeah, it's on my bucket list to someday meet Ken Wilber, because he has been able to shed clarity on some of these abstract concepts. It's valuable work. And like you, Sally, I share a deep passion for the topic of evolution. I'm sure like we'll have many more encounters, and I would love to collaborate with you on many more topics, upcoming topics, because it's a constantly developing field. And especially when I was reading about Rudolf Steiner's perspective, I'm more and more seeing like sometimes, because I work in tech world, I see this more where we have built a lot of complex technology on kind of like black boxes, and black boxes on top of black boxes, and no one really understands how each layer works. And it's very interesting, like some thinkers like Rudolf have thought about some of these things like 100 years ago, like how we may find ourselves in like traps because of these things, where we lose focus on where did all this come from. And
yeah, someone like Ian McGilchrist would say that's because we're just looking through our left brain, and to always make sure we open up to the bigger picture through our right brain. So it's a matter of, is it a narrow focus or is it a wide focus? And to always remember to keep the big picture in mind, always. Otherwise we go down rabbit holes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I would love to stay in touch with you and have more future, ongoing collaborations. I hope this is not just the last conversation.
I am so grateful that, I don't know if you'd be offended if I call you a millennial. I'm absolutely amazed at your grasp, and I'm so grateful that you're bringing this to the public, Suma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. This was definitely an insightful conversation for me, and I would be happy to stay in touch with you. And if some of the viewers want to get in touch with you, it seems like your website, sallyadnamsjones.com, is the...
That's a good place to start. And then also coming up in 2023, I'm doing a podcast with Dr. Jen Rich-Peer and Peer-Rich, and she and I are going to be on most major platforms, and it'll be called Radical Emergence: Conversations on the Edge of Transformation. So there'll be 2 a month. That's a helpful place to go. There'll be more upcoming YouTubes. There's a couple. You can just Google my name. Yeah, and then there's the book as well, if you want to see my practical work with suffering and trauma. That's Art Making with Refugees. Thanks, Suma.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to your new podcast. Whenever the link is ready, I'll include that also in this description.
And last thing I might say is, if people want to find me on Facebook, I'm starting resurrecting my professional page, which is called Transformata. TransformArta, and that's going to have a lot of just live videos on what transformation is. If people, and I'm not selling anything, I'm not selling my teachings, I'm just giving them away on Facebook if people want to find me there.
Yeah, I looked into that last night. It seemed like you were sharing something about AI and arts. I'm sure we'll have more in-depth conversation on that. I'm really interested in your perspective as an artist with what's happening with the AI art world right now.
Thanks, Suma. Well, we'll be chatting. I love this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thanks to the audience.